but it's a variation that comes into play and helps you overlook these flaws. There'll be enemies that are good shots from afar, there'll be those that rush at you with melee weapons, and there'll be those that are heavily shielded or have brutal amounts of health points, and those that are fucking annoying as hell and suicide charge at you with grenades. And they're pretty good about lobbing those grenades and flushing you out from your cover. Factor in that the game features critical hits, either headshots, or if an enemy has a hardened hide, they'll have some vulnerable areas like the fleshy parts inside the mouths of these dog-like scrags, or the backsides, meaning the abdomen and thorax sections of these giant ant-like creatures, forcing you to go for accuracy, and different guns doing different damages to different enemies, and that these guys are shooting at you constantly as they move slowly towards you, and the gunplay becomes enjoyable and allows you to overlook some of its flaws. A noteworthy note about these vulnerable areas of certain beasties, they cleverly implemented. For instance, the ants and scrags are designed in a way that it's pretty obvious that they've got thick hides protecting their heads, so you know that shooting their heads repeatedly won't do much good. When a scrag opens its mouth to reveal its fleshy insides, it's pretty obvious that shooting them there would do some damage. When an ant is to its sides, it's pretty obvious by the way their thorax and abdomen look that these areas are its vulnerable spots. And Borderlands makes these smart design choices throughout. You'll see enemies that are obviously meant to be headshotted, enemies that have big blue eyes and are just begging to be shot, enemies with tiny midsections that look like if you shoot them there, they'll break apart, and so forth. I applaud Borderlands for thinking this through instead of making nonsensical design choices for enemies or using cheap-ass glowing parts to make players aware of vulnerable areas. But perhaps the most satisfying thing about the gunplay are the guns. As advertised, you get a slew of guns at your disposal. Most aren't particularly all that different from each other beyond slight statistical variations, but it is extremely satisfying when you find that rare gun with exceptional abilities. But more importantly, the guns feel right and the enemies react to being shot as you'd expect them to, and then some. There are some very hilarious and satisfying death animations. Beyond that, the sound effects for the guns are terrific, and they pack an oomph, and the characters will react in a way that feels just right to the kind of impact you'd imagine your shooting should have on them. Like an enemy stiffening up when his head gets blown to pieces, or a shotgun knocking back an enemy 2 feet in the air, or stopping in its track in its attempted charge at you. I've played this game almost 35 hours and in a 4-day span, which is unprecedented for me, and it's the gunplay that has kept me going, because I enjoyed finding guns and using them so much. I don't think I've been this satisfied with a game's gunplay since Fear. There are very memorable moments strewn throughout the game. Boss fights in particular are memorable in terms of a fighting style, their character, and oftentimes their appearance. Fighting a big-ass monster is always enjoyable for me. The more imposing the better, and some of these monsters are very imposing. Needless to say, I ran like a little girl when I saw them. But the most memorable fight happens near the end of the game. I won't show clips of it or reveal much about it, but I will say that this occurs in a town called Old Haven. The quest that sends you to Old Haven is a really long quest, and you're constantly attacked from enemies from all sides. A typical scenario in Old Haven was of me engaging several enemies, me backing away because I was getting hammered, only to round a corner and encounter another group patrolling that area, me screaming like a little girl and cursing at them, me being stuck at a crossroad with one group of enemies approaching me from one road and the other from another. And all this for a quest that spans about 30 minutes in length that has you running from one end of the town to another while being shot at constantly. It was one of the most exhilarating fights. The driving in the game is pretty fun. For the PC version, the default is mouse and keyboard, and it works very well and makes the driving far more enjoyable than, say, in games like Crysis, in which the keyboard controls were awkward and cumbersome. You're going to be covering a lot of ground in the game, and the game smartly introduces you to new modes of travel at just the right moments. The car battles are somewhat decent, but thankfully few and far between. Overall, the driving doesn't make the game, but it certainly doesn't break it either, like a lot of driving portions do in other games. And I haven't even mentioned the action RPG mechanics. I think the quest and stats and loot systems are most similar to games like World of Warcraft. I won't go into details, you'd have to find another review or a preview of the game for that. But I will say that there are 4 different characters, and though essentially all are gun-toting and the basic gameplay will be similar for each character, there's enough in the stat system that will make playing through the game with each character worthwhile. Basically, the 4 characters are distinct in 2 ways: the guns they start out with and the one ability that is unique to each character. The gun that you start out with makes a difference, mainly in that the more you use a particular gun, the more proficient you become at using it. More importantly, the game is very generous about giving you that gun's ammo in the beginning stages of the game, and it won't give you other guns to use for a good chunk of the beginning. That means that you'll get a head start with whatever gun the character possesses from the get-go, meaning that you'll probably stick with it as your primary weapon of choice throughout. Of course, you don't have to, but the developers designed the game in such a way as to give you that incentive to stick with your starting weapon type. The more substantial means by which replaying the game with different characters is made worthwhile is the special ability each character has. One character gets a special hawk-like pet that you can unleash at enemies, and it mainly serves as a means to help you eliminate specific enemies. The soldier has the ability to set up a shielded turret, which avails you certain tactics like setting it up at choke points and if you're running low on health and don't have cover nearby. The Siren's ability is probably the most tactical of them all. Mainly you can use it to close huge gaps or get behind enemies, which works particularly well on those that have vulnerable asses. But my favorite of these is the big guys, who I like to refer as a heavy. And not because he's fat or anything, but because his punching frenzy is so similar to that of a heavy in Team Fortress 2. If you've ever went around trying to punch people to death as a heavy in TF2, you know just how enjoyable punching people can be. And it's the same for the heavy in Borderlands. It's so satisfying running around punching people and seeing enemies desperately backpedal and scream like little girls. I don't care to find faults with a game, though it does have them in plenty. That would feel like nitpicking. Pigeonholing a game and having preconceived expectations and misconceptions of it can often lead one to misconstrue its value and miss out on what makes a game great. After reading and watching several reviews, I feel that many have made this mistake in reviewing this game. Certainly, you can point out many of its flaws and shortcomings and conclude thus that the game isn't quite the AAA title that I believe it to be, but I feel that doing so is an injustice to its overall excellence. Borderlands is by no means perfect. The RPG mechanics and loot and stat system fall short of those in MMO or action RPGs, and the enemy AI is quite poor at times. But given that it combines the RPG mechanics of those RPGs and the joy of gunning down enemies of any competent first-person shooter, and is set in a world that's worth exploring, and manages to stretch the game to approximately 25 hours without needlessly prolonging it with hours of fillers, I'd say that this game has achieved something akin to perfection.